We have some breaking news that we are very sorry to report, and that is that Dolly Parton has died.
She wrote more than 3,000 songs. She turned a two-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee into one of the most recognized names in American music history. She built a fortune estimated somewhere between $450 million and $650 million, depending on who is counting and how, and she gave away more of it than most people will ever earn in a lifetime. She turned poverty into a brand so powerful that rhinestones and blonde wigs became not a costume, but a declaration, a flag planted in the soil of a country that had once looked down at her and told her she was trash. And then, in the summer of 2026, the woman who had never stopped moving in 6 decades finally stopped. The rumors started before the family said a single word. The rumors always do when a legend dies. What really happened? What was the cause of death? Why did the family wait so long to speak? And how did a girl who grew up sleeping 3 and 4 to a bed in a one-room shack become one of the wealthiest self-made women in American history? A woman so rich that even the question of who inherits her empire has become a story of its own. Think about that for a moment. Because behind every rumor, behind every headline, behind every estimate of that $650 million, there is a story that is not glamorous. Not the kind of story the rhinestones suggest. It is a story about a girl from Locust Ridge who learned one lesson before she could read a contract, and that lesson would decide everything. That it doesn't matter what you build if you do not own it. Stay with us, because to understand how Dolly Parton died and what really happened in her final months, and why her nephew's voice broke when he finally spoke, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to a cabin with no electricity, in a county so poor that a coat made of patches felt like a luxury, to a child who decided, before she could fully understand the decision, that she was going to own everything she ever made. And we have to understand the price of that decision, because there was a price. There always is. On August 21st, 2026, 4 days before the world learned she was gone, Dolly Parton sat down and spoke quietly. She did not speak from a stage. She did not speak from behind a microphone with rhinestones catching the light. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have decided to stop pretending that everything is fine. She told People magazine that she had been dealing with some health issues. She said, "I just didn't pay attention to it when I was watching over Carl. Carl Dean, her husband of 58 years, had died earlier that year. And in the months she had spent watching over him, caring for him, sitting beside him through his final days, Dolly Parton had done what she had always done with her own pain. She had set it aside. She had looked after someone else first. That was the woman. That was always the woman. The health issues she referenced were not new. In the months before that August, reports had surfaced that she had been struggling with dehydration, with dizziness, and with kidney stones. Not minor inconveniences. Kidney stones in a woman of 80 are not something a person simply walks through. They force cancellations. They force rest. They force a woman who had not stopped moving in 6 decades to finally, reluctantly, stop. She had already canceled appearances. She had already pulled back from travel. In September of 2025, she had told those close to her that she needed, in her own words, a few procedures. She said it the way Dolly always said difficult things, lightly, with a kind of acceptance that made you believe it was nothing, even when it was something. Here is the question worth sitting with. Have you ever watched someone you love put everyone else before themselves, over and over, until their own body quietly paid the bill? Because that is what the rumors, all of them, actually point to. Not to a scandal, not a mystery, to something far more ordinary and far more heartbreaking. A woman who spent her entire life giving, who never once learned how to stop, and who let her own health wait until it was almost too late. On August 25th, 2026, Bryan Seaver, her nephew, the man who had served as her head of security for more than 2 decades, following in the footsteps of his father Larry before him, released a video announcement. He spoke carefully. He spoke with the weight of a man who had been asked to carry something almost too heavy to hold. "This video announcement," he said, "is something Dolly asked of me years ago. Before I fully absorbed it as a future reality, she had prepared him. Of course, she had. Dolly Parton had spent a lifetime preparing for every contingency, organizing every detail, leaving nothing to chance. Even this. Even her own farewell had been planned with the same quiet precision she had applied to everything else in her life. The cause of death was not disclosed. Bryan Seaver did not name it. The publicist did not name it. As of that morning, the official cause of death remained undetermined, pending review by the medical examiner of Sevier County, Tennessee. And that gap, that silence between what the family knew and what they chose to say, became the space where the rumors grew. What really happened? Did she die of the kidney stones? Of heart failure? Of the grief of losing Carl? Of something the family was hiding? The rumors did not wait for answers. They never do. What the family confirmed was only this: that she had been dealing with health struggles in her final months, that she had not been well, and that she was, in her nephew's words, now in the arms of Jesus, met by Carl, her parents, and countless others who have watched her and longed for her. That is all the family chose to say. And perhaps that is all that ever needs to be said about the ending. Because the ending is not the story of Dolly Parton. The story of Dolly Parton begins 80 years earlier, and it is a story about a girl who owned nothing and decided, before she could explain why, that she would own everything she ever created. Before we reach the fortune, before we reach the rumors, before we reach the nephew who finally broke his silence, we need to understand who Dolly Parton truly was before the world knew her name. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, the fourth of 12 children, in a two-room cabin on Locust Ridge in Sevier County, Tennessee, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a tobacco and corn farmer, a man of the land, largely illiterate, who signed legal documents with an X because no one had ever taught him to write his own name. Her mother, Avi Lee Parton, had married at 15 and spent the years that followed bearing children with the quiet endurance of a woman who had no other choice. The family was by any measure desperately poor. Not romantically poor, not cinematically poor. Poor in the way that leaves permanent marks. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no insulation against the freezing mountain winters. 12 children crammed into a space barely large enough for 4, sleeping 3 and 4 to a bed wrapped in quilts stitched together from flour sacks. In winter, ice formed on the inside of the windows, and the children woke shivering, their breath visible in the frigid air. Dolly would later recall with heartbreaking honesty, "We were dirt poor. I mean seriously poor. We didn't have 2 nickels to rub together." But it wasn't just material poverty that scarred her. It was the humiliation that came with it. At school, she was the girl the other children whispered about. The one who wore clothes stitched together from rags, whose shoes had holes so big her toes poked through. She remembered standing in line, watching the other girls in their store-bought dresses, feeling the burn of shame creep up her neck. "I knew I was poor," she admitted years later, "but I didn't know I was supposed to be ashamed of it until I saw how people looked at me. They called her trash. They laughed at her homemade dresses. They excluded her. And that wound, carved into a young heart, would never fully heal, no matter how many millions she later earned." Here is a question. What is the thing that was taken from you that you have never fully gotten back? Because for Dolly, the answer was dignity. And she spent her entire life building something that could never be taken away again. There was one light in that childhood, and it was music. Her mother sang old Appalachian ballads while she cooked beans over a wood stove. Her grandfather, a Pentecostal preacher, filled Sunday services with gospel hymns that shook the walls of the tiny mountain church. Music became the only currency the family had in abundance. By the time Dolly was 7, she was writing her own songs, scratching lyrics onto scraps of paper with broken pencils. At 10, she was performing on local radio. At 13, she had her own television show, and she made her debut at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, standing on that legendary stage in a homemade dress, trembling but determined. She also got her first guitar, a gift from her uncle, and she treated it like a lifeline, because that is what it was. There were still nights when dinner was nothing but cornbread and beans. Nights when her father sat at the table, head in his hands, crushed silently by the weight of mouths he could not feed. Nights when Dolly lay awake, staring at the ceiling, vowing with every fiber that she would escape. "I had to get out. she later confessed. Not because I didn't love my family. I loved them more than anything. But I knew if I stayed, I would drown in that poverty. I would become just another forgotten girl in the mountains. So the day after she graduated high school in 1964, the first member of her family to earn a diploma, Dolly Parton did not wait. She packed everything she owned into a cardboard suitcase, hugged her weeping mother goodbye, and climbed onto a Greyhound bus to Nashville. She was 18 years old. She was carrying $20, a guitar, and an unshakable belief that somewhere beyond those mountains, her voice would finally be heard. Her childhood had been brutal. It had left her hungry, scarred, and haunted by shame. But it had also forged something unbreakable inside her. A fire that no rejection, no mockery, no closed door could ever extinguish. The barefoot girl from the one-room cabin was about to walk into an industry that would try to crush her. But she had already survived worse. And the fire that had carried her out of the mountains was about to be tested by an industry that devoured dreamers by the thousand. When Dolly Parton arrived in Nashville in 1964, she believed her talent would speak for itself. She believed her voice, her songs, and her determination would be enough. She was wrong. Nashville was a city built on dreams, but it devoured dreamers. Every day, hundreds of young hopefuls flooded into Music Row, convinced they were destined for stardom. Most left broken, forgotten, buried under the weight of rejection. Dolly was determined not to be one of them. She moved into a cramped, roach-infested apartment with barely enough room to turn around. The rent was cheap, but even cheap was expensive when you had nothing. She survived on packets of ketchup stolen from diners, on crackers, and on whatever free food she could find. Some nights she went to bed with her stomach growling, the hunger a cruel echo of the childhood she thought she had escaped. She knocked on every door she could find: record labels, publishing houses, and radio stations, anywhere that might give her a chance. But the doors did not just close, they slammed. Executives looked at her and saw a joke. They saw a girl with too much makeup, hair piled too high, and clothes too tight. They heard her thick mountain accent and dismissed her before she could even open her mouth to sing. One executive told her bluntly, "You're too country for country music." Another laughed and said, "Honey, go home. Nashville doesn't need another nobody." The cruelest rejection came when they did let her sing. She would pour her heart into a performance, only to be met with indifferent shrugs. "Your voice is too high-pitched. Your songs are too simple. You'll never be taken seriously." Every rejection carved a little deeper. Every dismissal whispered the same lie she had heard in childhood. "You're not good enough." And in those moments, alone in her tiny apartment, Dolly wondered if they were right. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe the girl from the mountains did not belong in Nashville after all. Stop and think about that for a moment. How many people on this planet have the exact talent Dolly Parton had? And how many of them gave up somewhere in the cold rooms of that rejection, never knowing what they could have become? What separated Dolly Parton from the thousand who gave up? It was not luck. It was not charm. It was a refusal to believe the lie. But there was one problem. She was still getting nothing. She took any job she could find. She sang demos for other artists. She wrote songs relentlessly, filling notebooks with lyrics born from heartbreak, homesickness, and the stubborn refusal to quit. And then, in 1966, a small glimmer of hope. A struggling label called Monument Records offered her a contract. It was not the dream deal she had imagined. It was restrictive, low-paying, and came with no creative control. But it was a door. And Dolly kicked it open. Her first single, Dumb Blonde, was released in 1967. It was a defiant anthem, a middle finger to everyone who had underestimated her. The song climbed the charts. For the first time, people were hearing her name. But success came with a price. Monument wanted to mold her into something more palatable, more pop, and less country. They wanted to strip away the very essence of who she was. And worse, even as her songs charted, the money did not follow. Her contract was exploitative, designed to enrich the label while keeping her struggling. She was selling records, but she was still scraping by. still haunted by the fear that it could all disappear in an instant. And there was the loneliness. She missed her family desperately. She missed the mountains. She later admitted there were nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, thinking maybe she should just go home, marry a local boy, and forget all of this. But just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, fate intervened, in the form of a man named Porter Wagoner. Porter was a country music star, famous for his rhinestone suits and his syndicated television show. In 1967, he was looking for a new female co-host, and his team suggested Dolly. Porter saw something in her. Raw talent wrapped in charisma and grit. He offered her a spot on his show, a regular paycheck, and national exposure. It was the break she had been praying for, but it came with strings attached. Strings that would soon feel more like chains. She did not know it yet. But this partnership would be both her salvation and her prison. It would launch her to stardom, and it would trap her in a battle for creative freedom that would take years to win. And it would teach her the second great lesson of her life. The lesson she would carry into the story of the fortune, the story of the nephew, and the story of the cause of death rumors. That the people who say they are helping you are not always helping you. And that the only person you can trust with your work is yourself. When Dolly Parton joined the Porter Wagoner Show in 1967, it felt like a dream come true. After years of rejection, hunger, and obscurity, she was finally on national television, performing for millions of viewers every week. Week after week, audiences fell in love with the chemistry between Porter and Dolly. Their voices blended, and their banter felt warm, almost familial. Dolly's star began to rise. Her songs climbed the charts. She was no longer the nobody Nashville had dismissed. But behind the rhinestones and the applause, a darker truth was taking root. Porter Wagoner was not just her mentor and partner. He was becoming her controller. At first, the arrangement seemed reasonable. Porter had given Dolly her big break, and in return he expected loyalty. He managed her career, booked her shows, and guided her decisions. He told her what to wear, what to sing, and how to present herself. Dolly, grateful and still somewhat naive, went along with it. She trusted him. But trust, as she would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing. Porter's control began to tighten like a noose. He did not just manage her career, he owned it. The contract she had signed tied her to him in ways she had not fully understood. He took a significant percentage of her earnings, controlled her recording sessions, and had final say over which songs she could release. When Dolly wrote something she was proud of, something deeply personal, Porter would often dismiss it, insisting she record his choices instead. He treated me like I was his property, Dolly later admitted, her voice heavy with the weight of those years. He didn't see me as an artist. He saw me as an extension of his brand. The creative suffocation was unbearable. Dolly was a songwriter at heart, a storyteller who poured her soul into every lyric. But Porter wanted her to be his sidekick, his pretty blonde co-star who smiled, sang on cue, and never stepped out of line. He wanted her to stay exactly where he had placed her, beside him, below him, dependent on him. And when Dolly dared to push back, the battles began. They fought constantly. Heated arguments backstage, tense silences during rehearsals, bitter standoffs over song choices. He wielded his power like a weapon, reminding her again and again that without him, she would be nothing. He made me feel like I owed him everything, Dolly confessed. And maybe I did, but I also knew I was drowning. The toll was devastating. The vibrant, fearless girl who had arrived in Nashville with nothing but a dream was fading, replaced by a woman trapped in a gilded cage. She smiled for the cameras, sang her heart out on stage, and went home and wept in private. The fame she had fought so hard for felt hollow. The success felt like a betrayal of the artist she truly wanted to be. And yet she could not leave. The contract bound her to Porter for years. Breaking free would mean lawsuits, financial ruin, and possibly the end of her career. He held all the cards, and he was not letting go. But even in the darkest moments, Dolly kept writing. Late at night, alone in her apartment, she poured her pain, her frustration, her longing into songs. Songs Porter would never hear. Songs that spoke of freedom, heartbreak, and the desperate need to reclaim her life. One of those songs was "I Will Always Love You." It was not a love song in the traditional sense. It was a goodbye, a farewell to Porter, to the partnership that had both saved her and suffocated her. It was her way of saying thank you for what you gave me, but I have to go. I have to be free. In 1974, after 7 years of battles and tears and soul-crushing compromise, Dolly finally gathered the courage to leave. She walked into Porter's office, her hands trembling, and she sang him the song she had written. "I will always love you." Every note a plea, every word a goodbye. Porter listened in silence. When she finished, there were tears in his eyes. He did not want to let her go, but he could not deny the power of what she had just sung. Reluctantly, he agreed to release her, but freedom came at a cost. Porter demanded a settlement. Money Dolly did not have. She had to borrow, scrape, and sacrifice just to buy back her own career. And even after she left, the wounds lingered. The years under his control left scars that no amount of success could erase. And as Dolly stepped away from his shadow, she made a vow to herself. Never again. Never again would she let anyone control her voice, her art, or her destiny. She had learned the lesson. The only thing you can be certain of keeping is the thing you own. And she had just paid an enormous price to learn it. But she did not yet know that this hard-won lesson, forged in the crucible of Porter Wagner's control, would become the single most valuable decision in the history of her career. A decision worth more than all the rhinestones in the world. And it would be tested in a moment, the most famous entertainer in the world. In 1974, Dolly released "I Will Always Love You" as a single. It reached #1 on the country charts. The woman who had been told she was too country had written a goodbye and turned it into her freedom. And then, between the two chart runs, a phone call arrived. A call that would define not just her financial future, but the entire architecture of who she was as a businesswoman, an artist, and a human being who had grown up with nothing and decided that nothing would ever be taken from her again. The call came from the camp of Elvis Presley. Elvis wanted to record "I Will Always Love You." This was not a small thing. In 1975, Elvis was still one of the most commercially powerful names in American music. A recording by Elvis was not just an honor. It was a commercial event. It meant radio play at a scale few artists could manufacture. It meant a royalty stream that could sustain a career for years. It meant an association with a legend so large that the association itself had monetary value. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, a man whose entire understanding of negotiation was built on extracting maximum value for his client regardless of what it cost anyone else, presented the terms. Elvis would record the song. But in exchange, Dolly would cede 50% of the publishing rights, 50% of the intellectual property, 50% of everything the song had earned, and everything it would ever earn for as long as copyright law existed. Dolly Parton said no. She did say no immediately. She went home and she thought about it. She thought about what it meant to say no to Elvis Presley, to the king, to the man whose face was on every television in America, whose concerts sold out arenas, whose recordings were events. She thought about what it would mean for her career, for her reputation, and for her relationship with an industry that ran on the goodwill of powerful men. And then she cried. She cried for days, by her own account, because she loved Elvis. She loved his music. She loved what a recording by him would have meant. And then she said no anyway. "I cried all the way to the bank," she would later say. Elvis did not record the song. His people moved on. And the song sat in Dolly Parton's catalog, fully owned, 100% hers, for another 17 years. In 1992, a 29-year-old singer from Newark, New Jersey, named Whitney Houston, recorded "I Will Always Love You" for a film called The Bodyguard. The recording was not faithful to the original. It was a reimagining, a vocal performance of such staggering power and ambition that it essentially replaced the original in the public consciousness. It became the best-selling single ever recorded by a female artist. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It sold more than 20 million copies worldwide, and every single copy generated royalties that flowed entirely to Dolly Parton. The song she had written about leaving Porter Wagoner earned her an estimated $20 million from Whitney Houston's recording alone. $20 million from a decision she had made in a moment of grief, sitting alone with a phone call from Elvis's camp, choosing her own ownership over everything else the opportunity represented. And this is the decision that defines the business genius of Dolly Parton more completely than any other fact in her biography. Not because the money was large, though it was, because of what the decision required. It required her to say no to the most powerful entertainer in the world at a moment when she could not possibly have known that a greater opportunity was 17 years away. It required her to trust the song, to trust her own work, to trust that what she had created had value that no one else's name could manufacture or replace. She had learned this in Locust Ridge. She had learned it from her mother, who had taken scraps of fabric and told a story about Joseph while she sewed and turned poverty into something a child would carry forever. And she had learned it in the years under Porter Wagoner, when she saw exactly what it costs a woman to surrender control of the thing she made. The story you tell about a thing determines what that thing becomes. And the thing you own is the only thing no one can take away. By the time Whitney's version had finished its run on the charts, Dolly Parton's publishing catalog contained more than 3,000 songs, every one of them wholly and completely hers. And the catalog would become the quiet, beating heart of a fortune so large that $100 million could just disappear into it. But that was only the beginning. Because Dolly was not building a catalog, she was building an empire. And the numbers, whatever they are, $450 million, $650 million, are less interesting than the architecture of it. Because the architecture of her fortune is a direct mirror of the architecture of her life. Every dollar was a decision. Every dollar was a yes or a no. Every dollar was a refusal to let anyone take what she had made. The number depends on who you ask. Forbes in June of 2025 placed Dolly Parton's net worth at $450 million, ranking her among the wealthiest self-made women in America. Other estimates, applying a different methodology and a broader valuation of her assets, place the figure closer to $650 million. The gap between those two numbers is not a discrepancy born of carelessness. It is a reflection of how genuinely difficult it is to put a number on what Dolly Parton built, because what she built does not fit neatly into the categories financial analysts prefer. She was not a tech founder. She was not a woman who married into wealth or inherited a company or sold a single product to $1 billion valuation. She was a songwriter from a two-room cabin who built an empire one decision at a time. And the empire was so diversified, so layered, and so deeply woven into the fabric of American culture that arriving at a single accurate number requires a kind of accounting that goes beyond spreadsheets. Start with the catalog. More than 3,000 songs accumulated across 6 decades of relentless early morning writing sessions, publishing rights retained in their entirety. A rarity in an industry that has historically made its money by separating artists from the intellectual property they create. The catalog is estimated to be worth in excess of $150 million. That figure encompasses not just the songs everyone knows. Jolene, Coat of Many Colors, 9 to 5, I Will Always Love You. But thousands of compositions recorded by other artists, licensed for film and television, covered in every genre, and played in every corner of the world for the better part of 60 years. The catalog generates royalties estimated at roughly $85 million annually. Not from a single hit. From the cumulative weight of 3,000 individual acts of creation, each owned outright, each continuing to earn long after the moment of its writing. Then there is Dollywood. The theme park she co-owned in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, built on the foundation of an earlier attraction called Silver Dollar City, is the single largest non-musical asset in her portfolio. Her stake in Dollywood is estimated at $165 million. The park draws roughly 3 million visitors per year, generating revenue that flows not just into the business, but into the surrounding economy of Sevier County, the same county where she was born. The same county where her father signed legal documents with an X because no one had ever taught him to write his own name. She did not forget where she came from. She built an economic engine in the middle of it. Beyond the catalog and the park, the fortune draws from dozens of additional streams. film, and television, beginning with her Academy Award-nominated work on 9 to 5 and extending through decades of acting, producing, and licensing. Brand licensing, which turned her name and image into a commercial property that appears on everything from perfume to cookbooks to holiday merchandise. Real estate, including holdings in Tennessee that reflect both the scale of her wealth and the discretion with which she managed it. She was not a woman who displayed her fortune. She was a woman who built it quietly, behind the rhinestones, while the world was looking at the wigs. And then there is the philanthropy, which is not separate from the fortune but integral to it, because Dolly Parton understood something that very few wealthy people fully grasp. She understood that generosity, executed with the same precision she applied to everything else, is not a drain on a fortune. It is an expression of what the fortune is for. In 2020, when a vaccine for COVID-19 was still a distant hope, she donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center to fund research. That research contributed directly to the development of the vaccine. She did not announce it for recognition. She announced it because she wanted other donors to follow. They did. In 2022, Jeff Bezos awarded her $100 million through his Courage and Civility Award, a recognition of philanthropic leadership that came with no restrictions on how the money could be used. She gave the majority of it away, to libraries, to literacy programs, to the Imagination Library, the initiative she had founded in 1995, which by the time of her death had donated more than 260 million books to children in 5 countries. 1 book per month, from birth to age 5, mailed directly to the homes of enrolled children, free. Free because she had grown up in a house where books were scarce, and she had never forgotten what that scarcity felt like. Her father had signed his name with an X. She built a program that put books in the hands of 260 million children. The math of Dolly Parton's fortune, whether the final number is $450 million or $650 million, is ultimately less interesting than the architecture of it. She did not accumulate wealth by taking. She accumulated it by creating, by owning what she created, and by refusing, at every critical juncture, to let anyone take it from her. She had learned that in Locust Ridge. She had demonstrated it with Elvis. She had proved it with Whitney Houston. And she had spent 60 years in between building something so large and so deeply rooted in American soil that the question of its precise dollar value almost misses the point. The point is that she built it herself. Every dollar, every song, every book mailed to a child who will never know that the woman who sent it had once been that child herself. And this brings us, at last, to the question that the world is asking now. The question hiding behind every rumor about the cause of death. The question that makes the fortune a story even more than the talent was. Who inherits a fortune like this? Who inherits the $650 million? And what happens to it when there are no children to pass it to? For Dolly Parton and Carl Dean, no first inheritor was waiting in the wings. The couple married in 1966, and they remained married for 58 years until Carl died earlier in 2026. And they had no biological children. She had spoken about that choice over the years with the same equanimity she brought to everything else. She said that she had, in her own words, mothered the whole world instead. But here is the thing the world does not always understand about a fortune with no direct heirs. It does not simply evaporate. It goes somewhere. It is apportioned. And the quiet machinery of what happens to that fortune, the trusts, the estate, the distribution, the tens of millions that will flow to Dollywood, the tens of millions to the Imagination Library, and the restructuring of a life's work across the people who stood closest to her. That machinery is not glamorous. It is paperwork. It is courts. It is accountants. It is the slow, bureaucratic process of turning a living legend into a legal estate. And it is the reason that a group of people, the family she kept closest, are now the stewards of everything she built. It is also the reason that her nephew's silence mattered so much. Because Bryan Seaver was not just a security guard, he was a caretaker of the final chapter. He was the man she chose to carry the hardest words. And when he finally spoke, on August 25, 2026, the weight of the entire fortune, the entire life, and the entire absence of a biological heir rested on his shoulders. Years before that day, Dolly had sat down with Bryan and asked him to do one final thing for her. She had asked him to be the one to tell the world. "This video announcement," he said in the recording he released that morning, "is something Dolly asked of me years ago, before I fully absorbed it as a future reality." He paused. You could hear it in his voice. The weight of a man who had spent years rehearsing a moment he was not, in the end, remotely prepared for. As her head of security for more than 2 decades, a role my father Larry held before me, I have imagined the heaviness of this moment. But I haven't truly felt it until now. He called it an honor. He called it an honor mixed with pride and great sadness. And then he said the thing that, of everything spoken publicly in the hours after her death, carried the most Dolly Parton in it. The most of her actual voice, her actual theology, her actual way of moving through the world. "Sadness lies with us," he said, "not with Dolly." She had gone somewhere that did not require grief. She had gone to Carl, the quiet, private man she had married in 1966, the man who had spent 58 years being the still center of a life that never stopped moving and who had left before her. She had gone to her parents. She had gone, in the language of the faith she had never once been embarrassed to claim, to the place she had been singing about since she was 6 years old in a church in Sevier County. The cause of death, as of that morning, remained officially undetermined. The medical examiner would determine it in the weeks or months to come. What the family confirmed, what Dolly herself had confirmed 4 days earlier, was only that she had not been well, that she had been quietly dealing with the accumulated weight of dehydration, dizziness, and kidney stones, and that she had spent the months since Carl's death tending to her own health, the way she had always tended to difficult things by acknowledging it minimally and continuing anyway. She was 80 years old. She had not stopped. She had a Broadway musical scheduled to open. There were plans. There were always plans. And the people who now steward the estate, the people who will answer every question about what happens next, are the people she left in the life she built. The family she kept close. The millions of children she never met, but who are now, in the most literal sense she could make it, her legacy. There will be arguments in the months ahead about the money. There will be legal proceedings and estate decisions and battles over the valuation of assets that were never fully transparent while she was alive. There will be people who come forward with claims and stories and versions of events. There always are. That is what happens when a fortune of this size changes hands. It is not glamorous. It is not what the rhinestones suggested. It is the unglamorous machinery that follows every extraordinary life. The paperwork, the courts, the accountants. The slow bureaucratic process of transforming a living legend into an estate. But the songs will not go through probate. The songs will keep playing. Jolene will keep playing. Coat of Many Colors will keep playing. 9 to 5 will keep playing in offices and on playlists and in the particular corners of people's memories where certain songs take up permanent residence and refuse to leave. I Will Always Love, You Will Keep Playing. The version she recorded and the version Whitney Houston turned into the best-selling single in the history of female artists, and every other version recorded by every other artist who looked at those words and thought, yes, that is the thing I have been trying to say. She wrote it about leaving. She wrote it as a farewell to a man who had helped shape her, and it became a goodbye addressed to everyone who had ever helped shape her and everyone who ever would. She wrote it at a moment of grief and transition, on the other side of which she could not yet see what was waiting. That is what Dolly Parton always did. She wrote toward the thing she could not yet see. She trusted the song. She trusted the work. She trusted that what she had created had value that no one else's name could manufacture or replace. Not Elvis Presley's name, not anyone's. And she held on to it with both hands, through every test, every temptation, every powerful man who came to her with a contract designed to take half of what was hers. She held on. She kept writing. She kept waking at 3 or 4 in the morning when the world was quiet enough to hear what needed to be said. She kept sending books to children who did not know her name. She kept performing in the rhinestones and the wigs, the armor she had stitched together from the same impulse that had driven her mother to stitch a coat from patches of fabric while telling a story about Joseph. The impulse to take what is scarce and make it sacred. What really happened to Dolly Parton? If the rumors demand a single answer, maybe this is it. She did not die of kidney stones or dehydration or heartbreak or any of the rumors that will fill the space until the medical examiner speaks. She died the way she had lived, carrying everyone else first, setting her own pain aside until there was almost nothing left to set aside. She died as a woman who had spent 80 years proving the same lesson, the one she learned in a two-room cabin and defended against Elvis Presley and the king himself. That the story you tell about a thing determines what that thing becomes, and that the only thing no one can take from you is the thing you truly own. She died owning everything she ever created. She died having given away more than most people will ever earn. She died leaving a fortune she could have used to hold on to children she never had, and instead spent it giving millions of children the things she never had. And she died having already chosen the man who would carry the news, her nephew, who stood in front of the world with a breaking voice and told us that the sadness lies with us, not with Dolly. Leave a tribute in the comments for Dolly Parton, the girl from Locust Ridge who owned every word she ever wrote. What is the lesson of a life like hers? What does it mean to build something so large from so little, with so much given back? And what do we do now with the music she left behind? The 3,000 songs, the diary she kept for 6 decades, and the record of a life that was in every sense entirely and completely her own? Subscribe to the channel because every legend deserves to be remembered the right way. And if Dolly Parton taught us anything, it is that the world does not have to wait for the version of you are building. You can claim it, you can own it, you can build it, and you can give it away, all in the same life, and leave the rhinestones glittering behind you for the people still to come. Dolly Parton kept going until she could not go anymore. And that is not a tragedy. That is a gift. What she gave to 260 million children, what she gave to us all. That is the thing that outlives the fortune, the thing that outlives the rumors, the thing that no one can ever take away. She owned every word, and she left them all for us.